I stopped believing myself about 4 years ago, not in a dramatic crisis kind of way, in a quiet Tuesday morning kind of way. I tell myself I was going to do something, write, exercise, protect an evening, and then I wouldn't. And then it would happen again and again. At some point, can't tell you exactly when, my own promises stopped registering. The voice in my head that said, "We're going to do this tomorrow," would speak. And some deeper part of me, the part that actually decides what happens, would just not respond, like a text message left unread. I wasn't fighting myself anymore. I'd stopped that. Fighting requires believing there's something worth fighting for. I'd moved past that into something quieter and worse. I'd stopped making promises at all. And I didn't know it yet, but I was living inside a zero, a trust battery that had been draining for years, not from one big betrayal of myself, but from hundreds of small ones, promises made and not kept, intentions stated and abandoned, deposits I told myself I'd make tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. What I'm going to describe in this episode is how I started recharging it. Not with confidence, not with affirmations, but with evidence. Welcome back to Uplifted Living. I'm Nick Gilbert. This is Season 2, Episode 7. Here's what I want to give you today. First, a reframe that changed everything for me. Self-trust isn't a personality trait. It's not something you're born with or without. It's a balance sheet, built the same way you build trust with anyone, through kept promises. I'm calling this the trust battery. Then, I'm going to walk you through the year mine hit zero, and the one thing I got wrong the entire time I was trying to fix it. And then, 3 anchors. 3 ways to start recharging, starting tonight. In any relationship, trust operates on a ledger. Every kept promise is a deposit. Every broken promise is a withdrawal. And, this is the part we forget, you don't get to decide what counts as a promise. The other person does. If you tell a friend you'll call and you don't, that's a withdrawal. Even if you think that the call wasn't important. The content of the promise matters less than the fact that you made it and didn't keep it. Over time, the balance shifts. 1 or 2 withdrawals, most relationships absorb that. But a pattern, enough small withdrawals, and eventually the other person stops believing you. Not because they're bitter, because the evidence isn't there. Now apply this to the person whose promises you break most often. Not your partner, not your boss, not your friends. You. Every time you tell yourself you're going to do something, like, I'm going to write for 30 minutes, I'm going to stop checking my phone in the morning, I'm going to actually rest tonight, and you don't do it, the battery drains. Not all at once, quietly, 1 percentage point at a time. And the part of you that's keeping score isn't your conscious mind. Your conscious mind will rationalize anything. It's your nervous system. The part that learned across years that your word to yourself doesn't carry weight. And here's the thought I want you to notice if it's happening to you right now. You might be thinking, yeah, but I've broken so many promises to myself that it's pointless to even make new ones. What's one more? That thought is not clarity. That thought is a dead battery talking. You haven't stopped believing yourself because you're incapable of keeping promises. You've stopped believing yourself because you've been making promises that were impossible to keep. They were too big, too vague, too dependent on a version of you that doesn't exist at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. We're going to fix that today, not by trying harder, by making different promises. So, that's the frame. Self-trust isn't confidence. It's not self-esteem. It's a battery that charges with kept promises and drains with broken ones. The question isn't, do I believe in myself? It's, what evidence have I given myself to believe in? Let me show you what zero looked like in my own life. About 4 years ago, I went through a stretch where I couldn't follow through on anything that mattered to me. From the outside, it looked fine. I was working, I was showing up, I was functional, but on the inside, I'd stopped taking my own words seriously, completely. I tell myself I was going to exercise in the morning. I wouldn't. I tell myself I was going to protect an evening for something creative. I'd fill that evening with something else. I tell myself I was going to have a hard conversation. I'd put it off another week. Small promises, broken quietly. Nobody else would have noticed most of them, but I noticed. And something started to happen that I didn't have language for at the time. I stopped making promises at all because what was the point? I'd stopped believing I'd keep them, so I drifted. I let other people's priorities fill the space, and I told myself I was being flexible. I wasn't being flexible. I was unmoored. Here's what I got wrong the entire time. I thought the problem was motivation. I thought I needed more discipline. I thought something was fundamentally broken in me. The actual problem was simpler and harder to see. I was making promises I had no realistic plan to keep. Not, I'll exercise twice this week. Not, I'll protect one evening. Every morning, every evening, forever, completely. And when those promises broke, which they were always going to, I blamed myself instead of blaming the design. That's not a willpower problem. That's a promise design problem. And nobody teaches you how to make a promise to yourself that's actually keepable. The shift didn't start with a breakthrough. It started on a Tuesday. I told myself I would write for 15 minutes. Not an hour, not a full chapter, 15 minutes. And I did it. And the next day, I told myself the same thing. And I did it again. And something tiny but real happened inside of me. I had given myself a receipt. One piece of evidence, small, unimpressive, almost embarrassing in its smallness. And my word to myself meant something. That's what rebuilt it. Not a breakthrough. Tuesdays, 15-minute increments. Promises so small, they felt almost embarrassing to make out loud. Now, what do you actually do with this? I have 3 things, and the first one you can use before you go to bed tonight. The first anchor is the one almost everyone skips because it sounds too simple. When your trust battery is low, and especially when it's at 0, the instinct is to go big. Grand declarations. I'm going to work out 5 days a week. I'm going to wake up at 5 a.m. I'm going to meditate every day. But those aren't promises. They're wishes. And when they don't stick, which is almost guaranteed, you make another withdrawal from a battery that's already empty. So the first anchor is this. Make promises so small that keeping them is almost harder than breaking them. Not, I'm going to exercise more. Instead, tomorrow, before I check my phone, I'm going to do 5 minutes of some physical activity. Walking, stretching, biking. Not, I'm going to write every day. Instead, I'm going to open a document and write 3 sentences. Not I'm going to stop scrolling at night. Instead of that, replace it with I'm going to put my phone in the other room for the first 10 minutes after I get into bed. That will stop the scroll. Here's what I need you to understand about the trust battery. It doesn't care about the size of the promise. A small promise kept charges it just as much as a big one. But a small promise is actually keepable. And right now, what you need isn't results. What you need is receipts. Self-trust doesn't start with big wins. It starts with tiny receipts. The second week of those 15-minute writing sessions, I remember thinking, this is barely anything. This doesn't count. But it counted. Not because of what I produced. Most of it wasn't that good. But I showed up when I said I would. My nervous system logged that. The battery ticked up 1%. And 1%, when you're at 0, is everything. Here's the second problem. If you've been draining the battery for years, and let's admit it, most of us have, the deposits won't feel like anything at first. You keep a small promise to yourself, and nothing shifts. There's no confidence boost, no sudden self-belief. The voice is still there. That doesn't count. That was too small. Anyone could have done that. This is not a sign that it's not working. This is what recovery sounds like. The system that's been tracking withdrawals for years doesn't reverse overnight. It needs to see the evidence accumulate. So the second anchor is this. You have to actively notice that you kept the promise. Your default wiring, especially if you've been at 0 for a while, is to dismiss the evidence. You have to override that deliberately. At the end of the day, write down one thing you said you'd do and actually did. Not a gratitude list, not for anyone else, for the evidence file, for the part of you that's keeping score. Today, I said I'd take a walk at lunch and I did. Today, I said I'd go to bed by 11 p.m. and I did. Today, I said I'd have that conversation I was putting off and I did. You're not celebrating. You're not doing affirmations. You're collecting data. You're building a case to yourself that your word is starting to mean something again. Because here's what I've noticed. People who trust themselves deeply aren't the ones who never break promises. They're the ones who have so much evidence of kept promises that a broken one, a little, small, broken one, doesn't wipe out the balance sheet. They're operating with a trust surplus. If your battery is at 5%, one broken promise feels catastrophic because it is. There's nothing in reserve. But if your battery is at 80%, built on months of small deposits, you can miss a day and it doesn't rewrite who you are. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is surplus. This is the deepest one, and it's going to connect some threads. Most of us, when we break a promise to ourselves, we do something more damaging than the broken promise itself. We abandon the whole thing. We miss one workout and decide the week is shot. We scroll one night and decide we have no discipline. We break one promise and decide there's no point in making any. That second move, the abandonment, is actually worse than the first. Because what you're telling yourself is, if I can't be perfect, I might as well be nothing. And that becomes a promise of its own. A promise that you're not worth the repair. So here's the third anchor. When you break a promise to yourself, don't abandon the whole thing. Repair it. by making and keeping the very next one. Not tomorrow, not next week, the very next one. You said you'd write and you didn't? All right, fine, that happened. But right now, in this moment, you can make a new promise. I'm going to open the document and write for 5 minutes. And you keep it in the next 5 minutes. And that repair doesn't just prevent a withdrawal, it makes a deposit. It tells your nervous system, even when I slip, I come back. I don't abandon myself. The trust battery doesn't track streaks. It tracks return rate. How fast do you come back after you fall? Do you stay down and narrate your failure for 3 days? Or do you get up the same day and keep a small promise just to prove that one miss doesn't get to define the whole story? I still catch this in myself. I'll miss a morning routine and feel the pull, the almost gravitational pull to write the whole day off. Well, I already blew it. Might as well scroll for an hour. And I have to remind myself, no, one missed promise won't drain a battery that's been charging for months. But abandoning yourself for the rest of the day, that will. The repair is the practice, not the perfection. That is how you rebuild trust with yourself. Not through declarations, through deposits. Make promises you can actually keep. Collect the receipts. And when you break one, because you will, repair it. Don't abandon yourself. Those are 3 anchors. But before we close, I want to speak directly to someone right now. If you've been living with a dead trust battery for years, if you don't believe a single promise you make to yourself anymore, I want you to hear something. You didn't get here because you're weak. You got here because you've been making promises you weren't set up to keep. Big ones, vague ones, promises that depended on a version of you that was never going to show up at 6 a.m. or 5 a.m. on a Tuesday. And when those promises broke again and again, you blamed yourself instead of blaming the size of the promise. You made the withdrawal, and then you assigned yourself a story. I'm just not the kind of person who follows through. The story is not evidence. It's a narrative built on poorly designed promises. And here's what's true. The fact that you're still here, still listening, still wanting to trust yourself, still showing up to a podcast about doing the work is itself a promise you've kept. You showed up. You're here. That's a receipt right now. You don't need confidence. You don't need evidence. And you can start collecting it tonight. The beautiful thing, the thing that gives me hope, is that you don't need to become a different person. You just need to make one promise tonight that is so small that it will be harder to break than to keep. And then keep it. And then notice that you kept it. And then do it again tomorrow. That's how trust is built. Not in breakthroughs, in tiny receipts, stacked over time, until one day, without having noticed the shift, you realize you believe your own word again. Thank you for being here this week. If today's episode helped you see self-trust differently, not as a feeling you're supposed to conjure up, but as evidence you're supposed to collect, share it with someone who's been breaking promises to themselves for a long time and blaming themselves for it. Follow the show wherever you listen. This is season 2. We've been building something. The identity lag, the comparison compass, the charging port. One bad week, the volume knob, the slow burn, and now the trust battery. These aren't just episode titles. They're a toolkit, a calmer way to do this. And I'm glad you're building it with me. Take care of yourself, actually.